Welcome to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is brought to you weekly from the SPNN studios in St. Paul. Now, tonight we are going to talk about some events that occurred at a recent St. Paul City Council meeting. Now, for those of you who have been watching this program on a regular basis, you know that in the past few months, we have been covering the city of Maplewood and what they've been engaged in their efforts of economic development and robbing the sanitary sewer fund of $2 million so that they could purchase the Moose Lodge property at the corner of Frost and English, and all the shenanigans that are going to go on and how they're going to pay that money back through tax increment financing and hopes upon hopes that they're going to find a developer that they can pawn this property off on. And they've got environmental hazards, and they've got demolition, and all of these things. And so while you've been watching what Maplewood has been doing with the Moose Lodge property, you're thinking to yourself, woof, isn't it great that our community, whichever community that might be other than Maplewood, oh, woof, our community has dodged that bullet. We're not doing those kind of foolish things in our community. Well, tonight, we're going to be focusing on St. Paul and the boondoggle that they've gotten themselves into, which they should have known about, and yet they're all going to say it's a wonderful opportunity. And isn't it always a wonderful opportunity when a municipality buys a property for above its market value, knows that there's millions of dollars of chemical cleanup that's going to be necessary, and that they're going to have to be engaged in all kinds of bonding and financial shell games in order to do something with it, all in the name of economic development. Now, to help me with this particular topic this evening is Mr. Greg Copeland, who happens to live in St. Paul and who has been watching this issue very carefully because it involves the Hillcrest Golf Course property, which a few months ago, if you recall on the Citizens Reporter, we had reported that it was discovered, lo and behold, that that property had about $2.5 million worth of chemical cleanup, because in the course of being a golf course since 1926 or whenever it was, all those chemicals have left behind the residue of hazardous chemicals. And of course, the union that bought the property for like $6.5 million, they're thinking to themselves, how are we going to get rid of this albatross around our neck that we invested our union money into? And we've got now $2.5 million of cleanup. Well, guess who came to their rescue? None other than the St. Paul Port Authority, who paid $10 million for the property. Now, Mr. Copeland, tell us how you first became involved in looking at this issue.
You know, I was like a lot of other citizens. I was reading the newspaper and saw where the city was having these little conversations, and that the Port Authority, you know, was complaining about all this pollution out at this golf course. And you know, it wasn't that long ago that people were out there in their golf carts, Diana. You know, people were out hitting the little white ball. I mean, I've never been a golfer, but my grandfather was pretty good at that. And so I thought, my God, you mean we had all these people walking around on a Superfund site? From the perspective of the people who are running the St. Paul Port Authority, it sounds like the end of the world, and we ought to have spacesuits on, right? Instead of, you know, having your golf bag, you know, bring your breathing apparatus. So in any event, well, then I pick up the paper here back at the end of the month, or actually it was the end of the month when the sale went through, is more recently, about a couple weeks after, that the Pioneer Press reports that the Port Authority's actually bought the property. Now that the common, and I'm going only by their reports, I have not seen a purchase agreement. You know, I believe kind of like the county and the state do, that you don't know what somebody paid for the property until you see the documents. Would you agree?
I would agree completely, yes.
So there you are. So, I mean, right now we're being told that the Port Authority paid $10 million. And I don't know how they arranged to buy it. I don't know how they had a closing on the property because supposedly they don't have the money. And the reason I say that is because the headline in the Pioneer Press, we got to give them credit. Fred Melo, you did a good job. You know, we got that headline here that we're all going to get to pay $5 forever for the rest of my life so that the city can own the Hillcrest Golf Course to bring in 1,000 homes and 1,000 jobs. That's what the PR is from the Port Authority.
And typically, you know, when you have a piece of property that you know has challenges to it, like that there is buildings on it that need to be demolished because maybe they're dilapidated, or you've got a brownfield where there's chemical cleanup that needs to be done, that is calculated into the price, and so that the price is generally then decreased as a result of the fact that you, the buyer, are going to have to put in this extra money to bring the property up to snuff so you can do something with it, whether or not if it's to develop it as residential or commercial or a combination thereof. I mean, that's part of what that calculation normally is. If you were a private entity, a private individual, somebody or that isn't, you know, out there having to be accountable to shareholders or to yourself, either way. Or maybe you've got a bank.
Or to a bank, yes, exactly.
And in this case, how can it be that the Port Authority paid $10 million for a piece of property that, well, at the last time that it was looked at, it had a market value of $6.5 million because that was a willing buyer and a willing seller. And now we know that it's got $2.5 million of cleanup that needs to be done. So that should have been figured in there. And so I would think that certainly the union who owned the property is a willing seller at $10 million. But my question is, why would the Port Authority be a willing buyer at $10 million?
Well, these are excellent questions, and I think we ought to look at who sits on the Port Authority as well, because we've got somebody from Merrill Lynch, we've got somebody from Western Bank, we got somebody from Xcel Energy. So we have some representation from some large private corporations that know the value of money and how to buy and sell things. Then we've got a couple of members of the City Council, Mitra Nelson, who's new since her special election win in Ward 4. And we have Dai Tao from the Frogtown area, our members. And there's a guy that used to work for Chris Coleman as his chief of staff named Paul Williams, who works for, I think it's Project Pride and Living or something over in Minneapolis. They used to have an office here in St. Paul, but I believe they're just over there in Minneapolis. Now he's the chair of the board. And so obviously, and I forgot, there's a gentleman from the trade union organization as well.
I see. So there's somebody serving on the union, from the union who's serving on the Port Authority board.
Trade and labor, yeah.
Oh, okay, I see.
Sure.
Well, they would certainly want to help out.
The plumbers?
Yeah, I can see. And what would be fascinating to know is whether or not, if the union who owned the property, if they had a mortgage on that property as well. Did they owe any money to a bank for that property? And is there any connection between that bank and Western Bank? I mean, I don't know. It's just the kind of questions, though, that should have been asked, because I did go and listen to the St. Paul City Council meeting where they talked about this, and we will have film footage of that meeting. And I listened to it, and I'd heard no questions from the city council members asking about the discussions that went on at the Port Authority, whether or not if there were any discussions about how to protect against conflicts of interest, which potentially there could be. Obviously, we've identified a couple that are potential.
Sure.
That's right. And also this consideration of the price. as to how did the $2.5 million of cleanup costs figure into that price, because ultimately now the Port Authority is going to the St. Paul City Council, hat in hand, saying, oh, gee whiz, help us out. Now that we bought this albatross at twice the price, now we need you to help us out. Oh, gee whiz, how easy.
Well, and they're wanting the city council to approve sending the bill for this sale for the purchase by the Port Authority to every household in St. Paul. Every property taxpayer in St. Paul is going to get to participate, as they say. So that's the plan. Now, today was the day that they were actually going to vote on adoption of the ordinance. They had a public hearing, and I understand you've got the footage of that, Diana. And the public hearing, as I understand it, had a testifier from the Port Authority, and of course he's telling them all the reasons they ought to do it, making a bunch of promises about what they're not going to ask the city to do in the future with regard to establishing a TIF district, for example, a tax increment financing district, which would allow new industries to pay the least amount of property taxes that they can possibly for maybe 20, 25 years, depending on what the arrangement might be in a TIF. But that's off the table. And then they're promising also to take any cost, that Port Authority is to take any cost on for off-site infrastructure improvements that they'll need to hook up to the Met Council sewer. You know, that could be big. Then there's also a promise by the Port Authority board here to not do anything, you know, that would cause any other subsequent issue, to color the financing. And then you've got the promise of a green space, 15 acres of green space, and 5 acres of improved parkland. You know, it's about 18% of the development, which is 112 acres.
And what's funny and ironic, when I'm thinking of this, that the promise of 5 acres of dedicated parkland, we're talking about a golf course that, first of all, is all greenways. And that there's either water detention pond areas, or you have sand pits, or you have sod or trees. And so how hard is it going to be to rope off 5 acres to say, aha, here's the park area? I mean, is that really a substantial promise?
And the problem that I have with the whole concept is that, you know, number one, if you look back at the Ford plant discussion, right? I mean, I didn't agree with a lot of things Chris Coleman did, but my God, they had years of discussion about this property. And what did they conclude? Well, tear down the building. I don't know. I think we would have been better off to have a new employer there. But that wasn't the choice that the city made or that Ford made. So here we are. But they spent a lot of time talking about density. They talked about commercial development. They talked about housing, all the rest. And on that's over in Highland, you know, where the big money is. But over on the east side, where us folks live who don't have a lot of money and who like to, you know, have jobs close to home, because people do drive a distance now to get to work very frequently. There's no discussion about what happens to the neighborhood, because if you know that golf course, Diana, and I know you know it well, it's surrounded by single-family residences all over. It's a big residential park, essentially.
Right.
People are looking across the street at a park, at a green space right now. So are they going to come in there and start leveling and creating little industrial pads? Because they're talking about 1,000 jobs. You gotta create some internal roadways and all the rest.
And of course, we'll hear some of that in that film footage too.
Sure.
And one thing that I want to mention to our viewers is that you indicated that, you know, on this this meeting of July 10th, I believe it was, that they had a public hearing about this ordinance and about whether or not they're going to pass along this assessment of $5 average per taxpayer in St. Paul to help pay for this albatross, right? Well, here is the problem, is that most people in St. Paul probably didn't even know that this was an ordinance that was being considered. They also probably didn't know that there was going to be a public hearing for them to get up and stand up and talk about how they felt about the whole issue. And of course, the viewers out there are going to say, well, how can that be that people wouldn't know what the, what the items are on the agenda or what the ordinances are that are being considered to change? Well, there were a couple of other ordinances that were on the agenda before the Port Authority ordinance. So let's take a look. We're going to take a little an aside here, and we're going to take a look at one of those ordinances that was on the agenda. And then when we are watching it, you think to yourself, do I know what they're even talking about? And how is this ordinance going to change what we currently have? And what the heck is going on? So let's take a look.
Item number 93, ordinance 19-36, amending chapter 15 of the Administrative Code to create a process to cancel city council meetings.
This is a public hearing. Is there anyone here to speak to this item? Seeing none, Ms. Jalali Nelson moves to close the public hearing. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion prevails.
5 in favor, no one opposed.
Okay, so what was the problem that they're trying to solve? Okay, this ordinance is to create a process for canceling city council meetings. Okay, well, generally the reason you might not have a city council meeting is because there isn't a quorum, there's a blizzard, there is a storm warning out that tells people to stay home, or that it is a freezing advisory. Those are generally the reasons why you wouldn't have a city council meeting. So what is the process? You know, St. Paul has been a city for over 100 years, I think.
Yeah.
Probably, I don't know, long time.
1858.
Okay, well, a
I
long
believe.
time.
Oh, 1854, sorry. It's 1858. The state of Minnesota's been here, so we actually predate the state.
So makes my point entirely, is that they've been operating as a city all that time, and it's only now that they need a process for canceling city council meetings? There must be something more behind it, and yet, as a viewer, we don't know.
Right.
The public doesn't know.
No staff report.
No staff report.
None.
Nobody from the public there to testify. It's mind-boggling. So let's take a look at the next ordinance and see if we get any more information on this ordinance.
Public hearing is closed and the ordinance is laid over to July 17th for final adoption. Item number 94, ordinance 19-37, amending chapter 76 of the Legislative Code pertaining to sewers and drains by adding new language authorizing the creation of special sanitary sewer availability districts and authorizing the imposition and collection of connection charges within such districts where facilities were constructed, enlarged, or improved to manage increased sanitary sewer volume within the district. This public hearing is continued from June 26th.
And for people following along on this item, we had to, we opened the public hearing last week, held it open till this week just due to a noticing blip. And so we will hold our public hearing, and then we are able to close the public hearing and approve this evening. So this is a public hearing. Is there anyone here to speak to this item? Seeing none, Mr. Tao moves to close the public hearing and approve. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion prevails.
5 in favor, no one opposed. The public hearing.
So what this new ordinance is all about is that now they've added language so that they can create additional sewer districts that when they're expanding or putting extra pipes in or extra connectors in, if you happen to be in one of those districts, guess what? I think you're going to be assessed a new tax. And yet, if people actually knew this is what was going on, would there have been somebody there at that public hearing? If it would have been clear and transparent to the residents of St. Paul that this is the kind of stuff that's going on at the St. Paul City Council meetings. Now, when do they usually have their city council meetings, by the way?
Wednesdays at 3:30 typically.
Oh,
Yeah,
in the afternoon, how convenient.
Right.
So when you're working where all the jobs are, which is over on the west side of the metropolitan area, you know, you're working in Hopkins, you're working in Eden Prairie,
Yeah.
you're working in Minneapolis, you're working
Burnsville,
in
you know.
Bloomington. You know what? You're not going to be able to make it over to St. Paul to get to your city council meeting at 3:30 to find out what they're going to tax you with. So isn't that fascinating? Okay, well, let's,
Well, no, the other great point about this is, you know, if you look at your water bill and you look at that sewer bill, well, here's the next new line item, because, you know, if they'd noticed people and they said, well, here's where we have improved the pipes, or where we plan to create larger pipes, you know darn well there'd be people there talking about this. Because people in St. Paul are pretty conservative when it comes to their money. Now, not their city officials aren't, but the people are. And so they show up when people are wanting more of their money. Even if they happen to agree with them, they just want to make sure what's going down is a little bit logical.
yes, exactly.
And in this case, a lie. So you did a great public service, Diana, bringing this to the people, believe me.
Well, next then, we're going to go back to our original topic, which is talking about what the Port Authority has done with regard to its purchase of the Hillcrest golf course property, and then, of course, their big ask to the St. Paul City Council. So coming up next then is the beginning of their presentation about that ordinance that's on their agenda. Let's take a look.
Is closed and the ordinance is adopted. Item number 95, ordinance 19-39, granting authority to the Port Authority for the city to issue and sell general obligation bonds to which the Port Authority pledges the full faith, credit, and resources of the city pursuant to the provisions and by authority of said Minnesota statutes, chapter 469 and 475 as amended.
Well, we are expecting a brief report from the Port Authority, and I believe they're in the hall. It's like the Von Trapps. Hi.
So we have a little nervous laughter there while we're waiting for the Port Authority to get their ducks in the row, because for some reason or other, they're out in the hallway even though they know they got this very important item on the agenda and they got to give a presentation. So let's just lollygag around in the hall for a while. Okay, well, let's continue with our clip.
Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the council. We're here today in support of the Port Authority's issuance of $10 million of general obligation bonds for the acquisition of the Hillcrest Golf Course site. As you know, we believe the site is an incredible opportunity for redevelopment, able to produce as many as 1,000 jobs and up to 1,000 housing units.
I'm going to pause you quick.
Yes.
Is this your first time testifying before?
Okay, so he just jumps right in and says what it is he needs. He needs 10 million in general obligation bonds. That's what he needs, 10 million. That's just a cool 10 million, that's it. Give it to me quick and I'll be on my way. Well, she of course backs him up a bit and says, hey dude, have you ever come before us yet, before in the past? Because you see, you probably should introduce yourself and kind of give a little intro. It's kind of like that beginning handshake, you know, you warm them up a little bit first before you just go for the jugular and say, yeah, I want that 10 million general obligation bond. So let's take a look.
It's been a minute.
Yeah.
I'm 2 weeks into paternity leave, so I've got dad brain, I will admit.
Okay, well, we're just going to reset quick. Would you mind starting just by introducing yourself and then start in, just so that we know who you are, but just because it's taped and not everybody does.
I'm Monty Hillman, Senior Vice President of Redevelopment at the St. Paul Port Authority.
Welcome.
Thank you for
It's
your time
wonderful to
today.
have you here.
Would be happy to answer any specific questions you have. And I know there is some detailed information that was included as attachment to the ordinance, exhibit to the ordinance. But again, the Port Authority views this as an incredible opportunity to provide economic development and a mix of land uses on the east side of St. Paul at a very affordable price for the public sector to engage.
Okay, so it is very important to the chair of the St. Paul City Council to be very transparent with who this guy is, his name, and his title. However, I mean, it's very important that everybody who's watching knows who he is. However, nobody knows what the deal is.
There you go.
Which is more important, knowing the name of the dude or knowing what the deal is? Mr. Copeland, now I know that you looked at the paperwork that was available in the packet, and what was it that you found was missing?
Well, they reference, as he did himself at the public hearing, in today's packet, we're doing this on the 17th, as your camera caption indicates. This is the day that they're going to vote on this thing, Diana. And the Exhibit A and B that he referred to, that the City Council was presented with, and that's the language they use in the document, I couldn't find that on the line. They had 3 documents listed, which basically are summaries of the text and then the full legislative text, which is 3 pages, that talks about what it is that the deal is for the full faith and credit of St. Paul property owners to be given to secure this $10 million that has already been spent and handed over because the closing was in June. The closing's in June on the 26th, and the St. Paul City Council is getting around to hearing from him last week, and they're going to close the deal with the Port Authority this week, after the process has already been determined that they're buying this thing and what they're going to do with it. Where's the public input here? I mean, the public is left out in the cold. If you're a property owner on any of the streets that abut the old Hillcrest Golf Course, you're wondering what the heck your new neighborhood's going to look like, because it's going away. Whatever's there now, Diana, is going away. They're telling you that, and what they're not telling you is really that you had an opportunity, apparently, if you were an insider, to go talk to somebody at the Port Authority. Oh, that's right, they didn't have any hearings either. Because when they have a meeting, all they do is put out a little announcement that says whoever the chair is, or the president, their executive director, essentially, is calling a meeting. They don't ever list a topic or anything. It's the lack of transparency with the Port Authority is incredible. It's nothing new. This is what they've been doing for a long time. But if you go to their website, what's the lead item? Oh, they're the poverty busters. Well, you know what? As a guy who's fought poverty all his life and now is in poverty in his own little, retirement here, honest to God, I wish everybody could have their poverty busted. But you know what? The people who own their homes, they're buying their homes over on the Hillcrest neighborhood that surround that property. They don't deserve to be put in a new kind of poverty, which means, oh, guess what? This nice neighborhood that used to back up to the golf course is now an industrial park.
Well, and here's something that you wouldn't be privy to, but a year and a half or so ago, when Maplewood had their comprehensive plan working group form and talk about how they wanted to change things for their 2040 comprehensive plan, I attended many of those meetings, and Put Your Hands Together Productions actually videotaped those meetings, and then we had news programs on what occurred at those meetings, because that was the only way for the public to know what was happening in those meetings. And one of the questions I posed at one of those events was in the area having to do with the Hillcrest Shopping Center and the Hillcrest Golf Course and that intersection of Larpenteur and Century. Has Maplewood been in communication with St. Paul and what they're going to do with the Hillcrest Golf Course? Because wouldn't it make sense that if Maplewood is making plans for that intersection, that it be in concert with their neighbor?
You would think.
And the response I got was, well, St. Paul doesn't really know what they're doing, so we're just going to do what we want to do. And you see, but that goes to your point in that 2 of the sides that abut the Hillcrest Golf Course are Maplewood. And those are Maplewood residents and Maplewood businesses that abut that property. And I think that they would like to know what is going on there so that they can figure out what to do with their own property. And it says here in the one article that I believe that there's 112 acres at the Hillcrest Golf Course. So that's a lot of property. And when they say 1,000 jobs, well, what kind of jobs are we talking about? Are they envisioning that they're only going to have these multi-use properties where they've got nail salons, coffee boutiques, and other little shops in which only pay minimum wage? Or are they looking to bring in good paying, sustainable jobs that are in competition with those employers over on the West Metro, where people on the east side need to drive to today to get their employment?
Yeah, I think based on the record that the Port Authority's created over the years, and I think we just look at Phelan Corridor, look at the Beacon Bluff area, which is the old 3M headquarters. They're putting a very large expansion of an existing business in St. Paul, Vamella Printing on that site. Going to be over 300 jobs at that location. That'll be, as they say, as the Port Authority says on its site, keeping them headquartered here in St. Paul. And they've done other job retention things like that. The McQueen Equipment Company that used to be over on Pryor is now over on the Phelan Corridor. The Bollinger Bakery that used to be down at the airport is on the Phelan Corridor. And there are other examples of where the Port Authority's gone in and redeveloped the property. And we have new and we have larger buildings with some of the old employers in town. Health East is another example. East Bend Front, they're now over here on Phelan Corridor. So as far as what's going to come in there, I think you're going to see things along the line of what we have in the area over by the interstate. You got some healthcare facilities. You've got south of there, you've got some industrial type uses. You got the that big laundry outfit. I'm trying to think of their name. Doesn't matter. But there are a number of things like that. And they try to do plants that don't have a lot of external waste. That something that uses the sewer system, that like the laundry would, so they're trying not to come in with a smokestack industries.
So
is the point. But nevertheless, you're dealing with a lot of traffic. You're going to be dealing with a lot of, just for employees, traffic. If you're dealing with 1,000 vehicles, because I don't know. I keep trying to tell this county that we have they need to buy some more buses, but it hasn't been working. So I don't know. I guess they're all going to be driving their cars. That's a lot of traffic that's going to be coming down McKnight.
Right, and so when you're thinking about that, it sounds like, okay, they've been working on some good projects and that they've been bringing some jobs or retaining some jobs in the east side of St. Paul. Okay, that's well and good. But if they overpaid for the property by paying $10 million, let's say if they could have bought it for $6 million or even $6.5 million, and then the union would have broke even, and they didn't have to do any of the cleanup, which I would think that they would be very happy about that they could actually pawn off the property on somebody who's going to go and do the cleanup so they didn't have to do it before they sold it. So you see, then if the Port Authority could have bought it for less because of those concerns, then they would have more resources than they could use to put into that redevelopment aspect of it, because there's only such a finite amount of money in any given project. Even the government eventually gets to a point where it's like, well, we're really down this rabbit hole now, and what are we going to do? Well, we're just going to have a big loss on our books and hope that nobody notices.
Well, I think,
other than the state auditor.
Yeah, well, I think people are paying attention. The current debt service, according to the 2019 budget that the city put out, is somewhere in the neighborhood of $76 million. It's the second largest department, if you will, according to their budget.
So is that the interest? That must be the interest that they're paying on all the obligations?
Well, as I understand, debt service. It's interest and principal that is owed during the course of the year to pay off the, well over 240 odd $million
so
that the
it's
city
like-
has. So
right.
just add another 10 mil now.
Right, so it's like that credit card payment every month, that you pay
Well.
your principal, you pay your interest,
Yeah.
and if your bill's too high, guess what? Your interest is more than your principal is.
Well,
So-
yeah. And it's, it's not a, well, I understated it. According to the budget, I'm just referring to the general obligation debt, no other debt. This would be money that has the full faith and credit of the city. In other words, the property tax base of the city pledged. 267 million, almost
So that's their
268.
debt.
That's what they're admitting to
Yeah. Wow.
in their budget. Now that's just the total general obligation debt. There could be other kinds of debt
Right,
as well,
right.
but in what is pledged here, we're talking about dollars to dollars, donuts to donuts, if you will, because they're asking, that is, the Port Authority's asking for general obligation bonds, so that adds $10 million to this 267 million, and
That is substantial.
well, in the median, they talk about a median household in the Pioneer Press report paying $5 more. Well, $5 more doesn't sound like a lot. But if your property values are going up and going up and going up over the years, that $5 is not standing still. And everybody knows that owns a home in St. Paul, because last year we had a tax increase of 14+%. The year before that, it went up 24%.
Right, and
And
it's
when your
always-
valuations are going up,
Well, and it's always important to remember that those valuations are set by the county.
Yes.
By a governmental entity that also benefits from the fact that the valuation goes up. So if the valuation goes up and they benefit from that because they can collect more taxes, you might, if you think it's not exactly right, you might want to object and have it readjusted. So let's get back, though, to our film footage from the city council meeting and the discussion and the presentation, if you want to call it that, from the gentleman from the Port Authority.
In a brownfield redevelopment that otherwise has been hindered by numerous constraints to the private sector. I won't go through all of those, but again, we do believe that the site has the capacity to house as many as 1,000 housing units, up to 1,000 jobs, and approximately $250 million of private investment, which would ultimately, at full build-out, generate over $5 million in annual property taxes. The city planning staff is preparing to launch a master planning process later this fall. The Port Authority will be actively engaged in that, be a robust community engagement exercise, I understand, speaking with our colleagues at PED. And of course, we intend to deliver outlots to the marketplace in accordance with the results of that master plan.
Great. And I mean, obviously,
Now, just to have a little comparison here, okay, he's talking about a $10 million GO bond obligation. And that, of course, as we get into this, you'll find out that much of that is for infrastructure. But he said, and he said it now again a second time, 1,000 units, 1,000 jobs. Well, of course, that sounds like easy numbers to just spin off your tongue when you're giving a presentation like this. But he indicated that he anticipated that there was going to be then, in addition to whatever the government's doing, $250 million of private investment. So that infers that they're looking for private developers maybe to come in, or private companies to establish their presence in this development. He doesn't go into any of the details, but that's what he infers. But I just wanted to do a rough comparison here, is that in Maplewood, remember, we've talked a lot about the development at the corner of Frost and English by Sherman and Associates in putting their high-density housing up, and that they're going to be doing more of it. And of course, it's all with tax increment financing support by the city of Maplewood. And that we played the clip the last couple of weeks from 2015 where the developer in front of the Maplewood City Council said, yep, you've got a you've got a $12.5 million development there at Frost and English, and that the developer only had a little over $200,000 private investment. So at least this gentleman is talking about a lot bigger numbers than what we've been seeing in Maplewood. In Maplewood, we got a quarter of $1,000,000. This guy is talking about $250 million of private investment. So I gotta say that does sound better than Maplewood, but the proof is in the pudding.
I think you, as you say, it sounds a certain way that's better from his point of view. He's selling. He's up there making his pitch. This guy should be, in a movie somewhere. Remember that movie, The Music Man?
There's no numbers. There's no data. There's no raw data
There's
here.
no data. There's no study. There's no proposal. There's nothing. And what did he say? He said, we're going to have a robust public process coming up. Well, you know what? Wait a minute. The cart is definitely in front of this horse. I ask, what is the rush? You know, we didn't rush into doing the Ford site this way. You took a very methodical point of view to this thing from the city's perspective. You know, even though I think the city decided early on, well, you know what, we're jettisoning industrial production at the site. Mm-hmm. And they decided on a residential type of project. Okay? But beyond that, there was much discussion over density, the layouts, the connections, the interactions with the current neighborhood. All of this got tremendous discussion over years. There were political campaigns that were fought.
And here's an important thing is that the city of St. Paul didn't buy that property, did they?
They did not.
They did not buy that property, and yet you had all that public engagement talking about how this property could be developed in the future. Here, they've just jumped on in, bought the property via the Port Authority, because ultimately, who's guaranteeing it but the city of St. Paul?
Yeah, who's all of us?
That's right.
Bottom line.
So you see, they're making it sound like before they could actually do anything with this project to get the public engagement, to get the plans together, they had to buy it.
Yeah.
And we know that that's not true because with the Ford site, they never bought the property and they still were able to put together a master plan that implemented the citizen input and comments from the community.
Yeah, the little golf course house there, clubhouse, if you will, we'll call it. It doesn't look much like a clubhouse now. It's been boarded up for some time. And frankly, when I hear the representative of the Port Authority, the employed person that they had at the hearing, the new dad-to-be, what's going on? He comes in there and he's telling the people about brownfields. You know, folks, I have to keep going back. If you take a little ride over to the Hillcrest Golf Course and just look in the front door, you're going to see the boarded up clubhouse. If you're right around the perimeter on McKnight, if you go down and ride around on the residential streets, either in Maplewood or in St. Paul that front this area, there's no brownfield, okay? There's no brownfield. I think this whole discussion about pollution and the $2.5 million, that all may be in some report somewhere. It may be that somebody studied it, took soil samples, they came up with all of that wonderful information. To what? I guess beat the price down, but then we're still paying $10 million.
Right.
So I don't understand that.
And that's the point, is that no one at this council meeting said, where are the reports and how did those reports on the environmental hazards and the brownfield, How did that enter into the negotiations?
Exactly.
There's no talk about the negotiations.
Yes.
Which of course there should have been by this council.
And the Pioneer Press story says it's herbicide pollution. Well, you know, that's a big step away from, oh my God, it's a Superfund site, just about. I mean, in the months before, when it was all in the Port Authority's jurisdiction, there's all these headlines about, oh my gosh, there's all this pollution. Nobody in the private sector wants to buy this property. It's a good thing we're here to save the day. Superman shows up, and he has apparently a son or a daughter that's coming along in his life. So we'll have another Superman. Aren't we lucky? But the point is, you know, maybe we're all tired of having Superman show up when we have to pay the bill and we don't have any information about any public benefit. What we have is a high-risk discussion that hasn't taken place, and the risk is to all the existing property owners. They're the people that are left out of this discussion, the people that own the homes in St. Paul and in Maplewood. They're the people that aren't included. They're marginalized completely by the city council.
Right, and certainly all the rest of the people in St. Paul too, because they're going to ultimately foot the bill.
Right, they're going to get the tax bill, but the people that are fronting that property
Yes.
are going to feel the immediate plus minus on their property values. And you're right, the whole city is going to get hit with the cost. There's no doubt about it. We're all in this together. It's like Shirley Chisholm used to say. We may have come over in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. I'm old enough to remember Shirley, and Shirley was right. And there needs to be more transparency.
Yes. Well, let's continue with our film footage.
There's uniform support here for this ordinance, so you know that the project is something we support. Would it be, if we could have you kind of just talk just a little bit about issuing and selling a general obligation bond for the Port Authority to do that, and how that connects to the city of St. Paul, and what the city's obligation is and what the port's obligation is? I think that would be helpful.
Before we listen to his presentation about those general obligation bonds, I want to point out something the chair of the St. Paul City Council said. She said, I want to tell you, you have uniform support up here. Now, they haven't voted on this. How does she know that there's uniform support? Mr. Copeland, earlier you mentioned that there were documents that were missing from the packet online. And my question is, were those same documents missing from the packet that they're obligated to have at that city council meeting? Because if they weren't in that council packet, and it's part of the data that the council is looking at when they make their decision, that's a violation of the open meeting law.
Well,
now, if these council members have been chitter-chattering back and forth about their uniform support for this or any other project, that's a violation of the open meeting law if they're doing it outside of a public noticed meeting. That's just the way it works. If there's a quorum of them, or they're doing it by daisy chain communications, that is a violation of the open meeting law. So how do we know, how do they know that there's uniform support? Perhaps they've talked about it on one of their consent agendas, which of course we wouldn't have any idea what that might be, since on their consent agendas, they don't tell you what any of the things are that they just pass.
Well, you know, Diana, in St. Paul, they have this thing called the organizational meeting. They used to have those only after the city council election every 4 years to elect the new officers and make appointments to the various boards that members of the council sit on. But now they use this euphemism of organizational meeting. And they used to, you know, they'd say, oh, we're going to discuss the fire department budget, or we're going to discuss a new ordinance to do something different with housing.
So you're thinking that maybe they used one of those meetings to talk about this?
I would not be surprised, because recently there was such a meeting, And you know what? When they announced the meeting, they didn't announce what the topic of the meeting was on the announcement. I'm sure that was just an oversight, a blip, as the chair of the city council would say, as the president of the city council would say. But you know, folks, we've had just a lot of blips lately. And the big blip on this project is that, you know, somebody's coming after us for a lot of money.
Yes. Well, we've got a little more film footage, so let's listen to his presentation on how these GO bonds work.
General obligation bonds of the Port Authority under statute require the approval by ordinance of the city council. It is a general obligation which does go against the taxpayers of the city of St. Paul, the citizens and taxpayers of the city of St. Paul. We estimate it will impact the median value household to the tune of about $5 a year annually for the 25-year term of the bonds.
Are there questions? Mr. Tolbert?
Could you go through kind of once the bonds are sold, what the next steps are for the port in terms of closing, as well as the next steps of community engagement?
The purchase was closed a couple weeks ago on June 26th. And so the Port Authority does now have fee title to the property. There is financial remuneration to the port, given the temporary nature of the funds that were used for closing, and an additional payment to the owner in order to get us to closing a couple weeks ago here. Beyond that, we have title. We've done our initial due diligence and have understood the constraints of the site and the potential costs to redevelop the site. And we're really looking forward to this planning process beginning this fall to really help inform anything before.
He said something about that the funds used to buy the land had a temporary nature to them. How can you use funds to buy land so that you are now the fee title owner, that you have the deed, and the funds that you used are temporary in nature? That sounds like one of those shell game loans that Maplewood just recently did, which is a intra-department or intra-fund loan where you go and you rob the money from the sanitary sewer fund on a temporary basis until you can go find some money somewhere else to pay it back. So what it sounds like to me is they went and they found some temporary money they could lift for a while. They also promised the seller that they would pay them some more money in the future because they didn't have all the money up front. So they paid them a big chunk of change and said, we'll pay you more in the future, kind of like a contract for a deed sort of a thing. And in the meanwhile, we'll go to the city of St. Paul, we'll get the money, and then we'll replace the temporary funds, and we'll pay the seller everything we owe to them, and then we'll be able to start that public process in the fall. That's what I heard. Is that what you heard?
I did, and I have to say, if I was sitting there listening to this dear gentleman who just shows up for his $10 million check without any data whatsoever, it's all just this verbal discussion, right? He's not referring to any document, to anything at all. It's amazing. I mean, if you went in to borrow money for your $150,000 house, oh, that's right, we don't have those anymore, $250,000 house at the bank, do you think you'd get off as light as this guy's getting off on $10 million for 25 years?
Well, that's a good,
I mean, my God, folks.
That's a good point, because none of us could go into a closing and say, you know, I've got some temporary funding where my grandma's given me $100,000 here. It's temporary, and I'm going to buy the house with it, and then I'm going to go to the bank afterwards. And then once I have that deed in my pocket, then I'm going to go and I'm going to try to find somebody else who is then going to pay my grandma back.
And I want to take
You know what? Nobody would let you do that at a closing.
I want to take your example, Diana, because what did you say? You talked about going to the bank, you know, for the money. Nobody in that example is thinking, well, hey, the bank could say no. And that's what's going on here. Somebody made a promise in advance.
Yes.
Somebody made a commitment in advance. Somebody, I think, who sits on a city council made commitments in advance.
And you know what? That goes to that uniform support because they knew those promises were made in advance. Well, let's continue on.
Or we would go out to start building anything.
Mr. Tolbert.
What are the expectations of the city? I mean, these are the only funds that will commit with the exception of staff time?
Yes, our agreement and our commitment to the city of St. Paul, the administration and the council as well, was that this is the only general obligation bond ask of the Port Authority. TIF will not be utilized at the site for infrastructure, et cetera. On a project-by-project basis, as we build the site out over the next 10 years, there may be other requests that come through for a specific project that we're unaware of at this time. But for the land development activity, infrastructure, remediation, demolition, geotechnical, stormwater, all that sort of stuff, this is the Port Authority's only request of the city for financial assistance.
And that includes,
What he said is this, is that this 10 million that he's asking the city for right now is for infrastructure and testing and cleanup and that sort of thing. And he's saying that we're not going to come to you and ask for tax increment financing for any of those items. But then he goes on to say, but that's not to say that when other specific projects come before us, that we won't be asking for more, that we could be asking for tax increment financing for specific projects as they come down the pike. Well, there you go. So while they say no tax increment financing, that's only for the phase of putting the pipes in and doing the cleanup. That's all we're talking about. When they come to doing the building and trying to entice those developers to decide that they want to make a profit off of St. Paul, well, then they're going to be using tax increment financing.
This is all the more reason why the council should have demanded, and not every council member sits on the Port Authority, so unless they were in these missing exhibits A and B that are referenced in the documents, then, you know, how do we know what is what? We don't know what if there was a $6 million purchase. Is there $4 million that's being used for increments of pipe and improvements of other things?
And here's another thing to point out to our viewers is that he indicated that these GO bonds would be for 25 years. The majority of those type of bonds that are used for road reconstruction projects or road improvement projects, infrastructure projects, are typically 15 years. So you see this particular issuance is going to be for 25 years.
A lot of interest.
And that's right. It's more interest and more time. And
More cost.
It's just really amazing. Well, I believe we have just a little bit left, and let's take a look.
infrastructure?
Yes.
So there won't be a request for infrastructure funding?
No.
Okay.
Great. So, Ms. Prince.
I want to be clear, and I appreciate my colleagues' concerns about Ford, but this is an incredibly important opportunity for the east side where we haven't seen this level of investment in a long period of time. It is a site that's the size of the Ford site. It's very strategic.
This level of investment on the east side? Of course not. Where else on the east side could you find that somebody, an entity of the government, paid $10 million for a piece of property that last was purchased for $6.5 million, that has $2.5 million of cleanup costs? Yes, that is a huge governmental investment. You bet. But is it the appropriate level of investment? Because maybe the city of St. Paul and the Port Authority could have gotten the same bang for the buck if they would have negotiated a little bit harder. Because certainly, as I indicated before, any seller is going to say, yes, I'd love to sell you my property for $10 million. But it's that buyer that should have said, you know, we've got all these cleanup costs, we have all these other costs. I think we should pare it down a little bit. Well, thank you, Mr. Copeland, for being here.
You're so welcome.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.